Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our next wild conversation. What's a consent decree, and how will it impact public safety reform, in particular here in Minnesota and in the Twin Cities? My name is Lucas Castor. I will be the moderator for today's panel. I am an attorney and at Nichols Castor in downtown Minneapolis. I am also a board member of TC-DIP and WILD. For those who are not familiar with TC-DIP, Twin Cities Diversity in Practice has been in place for several years in the Twin Cities and is focused on attracting, recruiting, retaining, and advancing attorneys of color in the Twin Cities. WILD, which is a 501c3 arm of TC-DIP, which is the Wanton Injustice Legal Detail, was started in June of 2020. Following the murder of George Floyd, and was spearheaded by our ELG co-leads at the time, Darnell Cage and Deidre Graham. And WILD is focused on 6 specific areas within the Twin Cities in order to achieve the goals of TC-DIP. And those areas are housing, education, equality, addressing and responding to systemic racism in policing, voting rights, rebuilding the Black community, and access to wealth opportunities. So those are the 6 areas of WILD. Today, we are going to have a program about the recent findings of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the consent decree between the state and the city. And we'll start with an overview of the findings by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. And then we will get into discussion with our panelists. And just so everyone is aware, there is a CLE code for this program. And the CLE program, the initial code is consent. You should see that on your screen. There will be a second code at the end of this panel that you'll receive in order to receive your CLE credit. I'm very excited today for the panel that we have here. We have 3 wonderful panelists, and I will let each of them do their own introductions. And we'll start with Commissioner Lucero.
Great. Good morning. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lucero, and I'm the Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. I am an attorney, and I am Chicana, a woman of color. So I'm very excited to be in this space where with this mission and this goal of bringing more people of color into the practice of law. There's only a few of us when I graduated. And so I appreciate the work that's going on here today. And I'm excited to participate in this panel. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Welcome, Commissioner. And then we'll go to Professor Moran.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Moran. I'm a professor at University of St. Thomas School of Law, where I teach courses related to criminal law and policing. Before I came to St. Thomas, I was a public defender. My practice career was as a public defender in Chicago. And I study and research in areas related to police accountability and public awareness of police misconduct. So I'm excited to be here as well to unpack the findings of the Department of Human Rights and try to help folks answer some questions about how we're moving forward from here.
Great, thank you, Professor. And now, last but certainly not least, Justin, if you can go ahead.
Thank you, Lucas. I appreciate it. My name is Justin Terrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. Our organization's mission is to transform the criminal legal system. We do that through research, education, and policy development. Currently, we're working with the Commissioner of Human Rights to prepare a report to the Commissioner on that includes input from community members on what should be included in the consent decree. And so I'm excited to be here, and these conversations are always great, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Well, we thank you for being here today, Justin, and as well as Commissioner Lucero and Professor Moran. We really appreciate your time this morning. We're going to start out, as I indicated at the beginning, with an overview of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights investigation and their findings. And so I will turn it over to Commissioner Lucero, who I believe has some slides that she will go through. And so I will turn it over to you, Commissioner.
Great. And are you, Lucas, can you confirm that you can see this?
I can.
Perfect. All right, everyone. All right, so let me just jump in here. I am hiding you guys. All right. So let me just start out by sharing that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is the state's largest, civil rights enforcement agency, and we are charged with upholding the civil rights for the people of Minnesota. The Minnesota Human Rights Act prohibits discrimination. It is 55 years old this year. It was passed into law in 1967. And the law powerfully states discrimination threatens the rights and privileges of the inhabitants of this state and menaces the institutions and foundations of democracy. So it's a really important statute that was passed into law in 1967 with some powerful tools built into that statute. It has three main primary duties. We are talking specifically about one of those pieces today, which is an investigation into a charge of discrimination. So you can find a lot more information about this investigation as well as the full findings on our website and kind of what's going on next steps and follow along here. So let me just go ahead and jump in with some information, kind of what brought us to this place and how we got here. So it was over 2 years ago, following the murder of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. The demands to end any discriminatory policing practices really reverberated across the world. Certainly at the Department of Human Rights, we heard this message loud and clear from community members and community leaders that there needed to be an investigation into any unlawful discriminatory policing in Minneapolis that was undermining public safety. So on June 1st, 2020, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights did just that. We launched this comprehensive pattern or practice investigation into the city of Minneapolis to determine if the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of race discrimination in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So I do want to stress this is a pattern or practice investigation. And so what does this mean? It means that this is not about one individual or one incident. And even to people who practice law regularly, oftentimes it is really based around an incident or an individual. So this is a little bit different. This is whether there is a pattern within the police department of treating people of color and Indigenous people differently because of their race. This means that this investigation is looking at a tremendous amount of both qualitative and quantitative data spanning from 2010 to the present. So you won't hear or see in the presentation or in the findings, you won't hear us talk about any specific officer or MPD leader or city leader. And that's because this is not about a specific person or incident, but about what patterns exist and where race is the likely reason. We do flag examples of specific incidents, but where we do, it's intended to be illustrative of the patterns that exist. So today, to just talk through this, I'm going to provide a brief overview about what the investigation consisted of, what are the findings of this investigation, and lay out the next steps, which is the work that we're doing right now to negotiate a consent decree with the city. There's a lot of information. We were very intentional about laying out the methodology and how we did this work throughout the findings. So you can go on the website to dive into all of these areas quite a bit more. But let me start by talking about what happened at the beginning when we launched this, and that's the temporary court order that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights obtained within about a week of announcing this investigation. This resulted in early and significant public safety changes in Minneapolis. So one clear example was the requirement that the city implement a policy banning all chokeholds and neck restraints without exception. So to be clear about this, before this temporary court order was put into place, chokeholds and neck restraints were allowed in Minneapolis. And because of this temporary court order, they are now banned in the city of Minneapolis without exception. Another example is that at the time the court order was entered, there was at least 65 completed police misconduct investigations awaiting the police chief's review. And at least 4 of those cases were over 200 days old. So having officers with potential misconduct files that needed to have discipline or training, any accountability measure, and them not receiving it meant that misconduct was allowed to continue and fester. But after the temporary court order was implemented, the police chief quickly moved on this backlog, and final discipline decisions are public on MPD's website for the first time ever. And as part of the temporary court order, the city and MPD were required to make these changes directly into their policies, ensuring they stay in effect even after the investigation ends. And they now need to be further codified into consent decree moving forward. What's important here is what has taken other cities years to implement, we did in the first week of the investigation. And that was the first week. So we already moved the goalpost significantly there. The work continues, but that's what we did at the beginning. And now I'd like to talk about the investigation itself. So this was a team of investigators which conducted a comprehensive investigation that looked at the City of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department over the past 10 years. You're going to see here ride-alongs and interviews with many MPD officers occurring in every precinct in person. And if you remember this time period, it was all during the height of COVID. And so we owe the rank and file of MPD a lot of gratitude for their forthcoming and honest feedback, for their willingness to meet with all of us. It was all voluntary for them. We heard recurring themes about the need for tools, resources, and strong leadership as being essential for success. You'll see here that the team of investigators watched approximately 700 hours of body-worn camera footage. This is really the first case where body-worn camera footage is used in a pattern or practice case like this, because of where we are in time, with how body-worn camera footage has been implemented over the past decade. And our team of investigators watched 700 hours of it. They also observed 87 hours of academy training and reviewed 480,000 pages of city and MPD documents. Think training materials, policies, assessments, emails, social media, discipline records, etc. I specifically want to hold space for the over 2,200 community members who we interviewed or provided reports to our agency about their experiences, as well as the 15 listening sessions, including many hosted by organizations and neighborhood associations across Minneapolis. A whole lot of gratitude to every community member who shared their experience with investigators throughout this investigation. We've worked really hard to make sure that we're talking directly to community members across Minneapolis, and that's reflected today in the work that Justin and his team are doing that Justin will talk about as well. But we really wanted to make sure that we got this work, that we did this right, and that our work reflected the correct information. So we worked with nationally recognized policing experts to complete this investigation. So this included policing practice experts at 21 CP Solutions, many of whom formerly served as police chiefs around the United States, and Greg Ridgway, who's a renowned policing statistician, really the very best criminology statistician and data science from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the chair of the Department of Criminology. And so doing this comprehensive investigation, we were able to see where the facts led us, make sure we got this right. And our findings, after completing our investigation, we found that the city and MPD engage in a pattern or practice of race discrimination in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Now I'm going to talk about where MPD officers engage in this pattern of race discrimination, and that's in really 3 areas. First, racial disparities in how MPD officers use force and conduct traffic stops against people of color, particularly Black community members, compared to white community members in similar circumstances. And for those of you who are data folks or particularly love the methodology, that similar circumstances, that apples to apples analysis is really important. And I encourage you to look at that. Second, how MPD officers use covert social media to surveil or falsely engage with Black leaders, Black organizations, and government officials unrelated to criminal activity. And the third area where MPD officers engage in a pattern of race discrimination is where MPD officers consistently use racist, misogynistic, and other disrespectful language. Now, this pattern of race discrimination, race-based policing is caused by an organizational culture of flawed training, which emphasizes a paramilitary approach to policing. It's caused by an organizational culture where there's deficient accountability systems that are designed to not hold officers accountable for misconduct and therefore fail to hold officers accountable for misconduct. And lastly, former and current city and MPD leaders have not collectively acted with the urgency, coordination, and intentionality, really the sustained and coordinated work that's necessary to address racial disparities in policing to improve public safety and increase community trust. If you were to watch our full presentation, we would go into details on all of these in more detail. You can find all of that on our website. But there is a finding, the last finding, and you'll see that in the determination on page 8, is that we find that without fundamental organizational culture change, reforming MPD's policies, procedures, and changes will be meaningless. This is a big statement. It talks about how we could change a policy here, change a policy there, do a training here. It's, you know, really the whack-a-mole of change. And it's going to take something much bigger than that, fundamental organizational change to actually create the reform that needs to happen here. And that speaks to the challenge that lies ahead and the need for consistent, coordinated movement from all of those involved. So let's talk about what's next here. So, of course, the process does not start or end with the findings. The city has made and continues to make efforts to address these concerns. And as we note throughout the determination, the city can make immediate changes that are fully within the control of the city and MPD and do not require modifications to the collective bargaining agreement or state law. And while the city is doing this work every day, including today, we also know that the city has been responsible for its own accountability and oversight of its police department for a very long time, and this is where we are. So we know coordinated and sustained independent oversight is necessary for Minneapolis. So that is why the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is working with the city to develop a consent decree to address this discriminatory race-based policing in Minneapolis. So here's a slide that lays out all the different pieces of a consent decree. But what I want to stress here is, unlike previous efforts to reform policing in Minneapolis, a consent decree is a legally binding agreement that the parties are required by law to follow. It lays out specific changes that the city and MPD will be required to make to address the pattern of race discrimination in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And because a consent decree is issued by a judge, it is the judge that holds parties accountable with monitors, that holds the parties accountable along with monitors or experts that report the progress directly to the court. And importantly, a consent decree lives on past all election cycles, and that provides for the sustained action that is necessary for success, because it's not subject to the whims or the challenges of election cycles, budgetary crises, elected officials, changes in leadership, that sustained action is necessary. You know, a consent decree is a tool. It's a very powerful tool, but it's only a tool, which is why we want to make sure we're being just as thoughtful in this next phase to get it right. So to that end, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is doing really engaged in thoughtful work with stakeholders to gather feedback on what should be included in a consent decree to address racial discrimination in policing in Minneapolis. Anyone can submit their ideas directly to MDHR on its website. We have already had, I want to say, 45 to 50 small group or bigger listening sessions, and then there's some more bigger engagement events coming up that I know Justin is going to talk about that we're really excited about. We also want to make sure we're hearing directly from police officers who need to be part of being of this process as well. So 21CP is going to be conducting those listening sessions, I believe, at the end of this month. You know, I started this presentation by talking about May of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and the demands to end discriminatory policing practices and how those demands reverberated across the world. There is a lot going on across this country and across the world, and those demands remain just as urgent today as they did 2 years ago, as they did 6 years ago. Yesterday was the 6-year anniversary of Philando Castile's death at the hands of a police officer as well. So there's a lot of work, and the demands remain just as urgent. So race-based policing, when it comes to what's going on in Minneapolis specifically, it is unlawful. It harms everyone. It especially harms people of color and Indigenous community members, sometimes costing community members their lives. So the work that we're doing with the city, MPD, and community members to improve public safety is important, because we need to reverse and put an end to unlawful and discriminatory policing practices. There's a lot of work that's going on. This is an important part of it. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it today. So thank you for the time. And I think, yeah, that is the end of this. Thank you, Lucas.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. And now we will transition into our general discussion about the Minnesota Department of Human Rights findings and generally consent decrees. As we get going into this discussion, there have been a few questions from attendees, I luckily have had the opportunity to read the report by and the findings by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. It's a pretty expansive and extensive investigation and findings. And I'm wondering, in particular, from Justin and Professor Moran's perspective, having heard Commissioner Lucero's overview, and I'm assuming read this report and understood kind of what the impact is, I'm interested in each of your perspectives in terms of just what this means and the impact that you foresee as a result of the Department of Human Rights investigation. Justin, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to the professor.
Yeah, I think that's the right question. It's the question I hear all the time, is like, what is the impact of this work? And I think for me, it starts first with addressing the gaslighting that's been happening in our community for generations. So we've had discrimination and racialized policing problem in Minneapolis since day one. And communities of color have been talking about that, resisting against that for years. We've seen efforts for reform we've seen efforts for reform that have gone absolutely nowhere. And then after the murder of George Floyd, we've definitely had some lots of progress. And I think that the moment that we have right now is less about, I think Kevin Reese put it really well after an event we did with them a week or so ago, where it's like, is the consent decree a solution to the end all be all problem? But that is a question. But what I'm clear about, and I think what a lot of community members who I've been talking with are clear about, is that it is the first step down a path towards justice, and everyone needs to get in line and encourage each other to stay on that path, because we have a lot of work to do in our city to make sure that we can build safe communities for all. Just a couple of highlights from the findings that I'll just point out that I think are significant for folks to pay attention to. The fact that the commissioner's findings highlight the need for cultural change, the need to address practices and not just policies, I also believe that pointing out the failure of accountability mechanisms within the department. And then it is always a healthy reminder for two things. One, that officers contributed to this, to these findings voluntarily. That is something that can't be ignored, that everyone, rather if you're on in the community as a community member, or if you're an officer that contributed to this, this investigation, that people understand that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And that to me says that we can work together to find a path forward.
Great, thank you, Justin. Professor Moran.
Sure, thanks, Lucas. And I'll pick up on the last thing Justin said. One of the most, to me, the most significant aspect of the investigation and the 72 pages of findings is that this is a systemic cultural issue. A lot of times I have conversations with people who want to talk about bad apples in the police department, the metaphorical bad officer. And that's fair. I get why people want to talk about that. The reality is the MPD is made up of hundreds of officers. Some of them are wonderful people. Some of them are definitely not. But if we're going to create change at a systems level, we need to not just be winnowing out a couple problematic people. We need to recognize that this is a bigger cultural issue. And that's what I really appreciate about the findings is after an in-depth investigation, they say some pretty important things. They talk about how MPD officers consistently use problematic, racist, misogynistic language. They talk about how the MPD culture coming from the top, coming from supervisors and coming from training is one that enforces aggression and compliance from the civilian population at all costs, even when maybe aggression and compliance are really not the appropriate tactics. They talk about how supervisors don't get much helpful training themselves. And so even if new classes of officers are going through, they enter an environment that has been for many decades enforced this culture of compliance and aggression and racism. The findings talk about the lack of accountability, which is a huge issue for me. That's what I study the most. And we have a department that, as Commissioner Lucero mentioned, has historically not acted quickly on misconduct allegations, has not disciplined appropriately, and has largely hidden from the public what the complaints are and how they've been resolved. Now, some of that is not just the MPD. Some of that is because we have a state law that prevents a lot of public access to complaints of misconduct. But some of that is how the Minneapolis Police Department has handled complaints. And they've handled it really problematically. And so it's a lot of pages, but it's really worth reading because there's a lot of eye-opening information about the system at work with the hundreds of officers as a whole. The other thing I want to briefly mention is if you are in a place where you want to blame the police, I think the findings make clear that other people are also part of the problem, but potentially part of the solution. And specifically, I want to highlight in the findings talking about how the City of Minneapolis, the City Attorney's Office, and the Hennepin County Attorney's Office has been, this is my language, not the language of the Department of Human Rights, but I would say complicit in the contributing to the lack of accountability by failing to maintain thorough databases of officers who do have misconduct allegations against them, and by failing at times to disclose that information when appropriate to people like defense attorneys who are trying to defend cases that the Minneapolis police have brought. And I say that just to kind of repeat the point Commissioner Lucero and Justin have already made, which is a lot of people need to be involved in the solutions. And it's nice, it's probably easy and tempting to just point the finger at a few people or even at the police department as a whole. There's actually, lawyers share the blame in this. A lot of other people do, a lot of inertia for many decades. And that's sad, but the positive aspect is a lot of people can contribute to change.
Great. Thank you, Professor. Commissioner, I want to come back to you because we had a question from an attendee with respect to the sort of immediate, if you want to call them a remedy or actions that the department were able to obtain through with the court order, the initial court order regarding the chokeholds and neck restraints. There's a question about whether the department has the power to similarly ban or obtain a ban on no-knock warrants in the same way it achieved those initial things after as part of the investigation.
Sure. So I think what might be helpful is to talk a little bit through where we are in the process right now. So you take a step back. We have completed our investigation, and once we complete an investigation, we issue findings, and our findings are either probable cause of discrimination or no probable cause of discrimination. Here we find probable cause of discrimination. And so next steps here are to see if we can work with the city and MPD directly to enter into, here we're working towards a consent decree, but enter into some sort of settlement. This one we're looking to a consent decree settlement to affect any of the changes that we would all agree to. So all parties would have to agree to it. So any change could be put forth as part of the, and built into the consent decree. The only changes that couldn't be included in it would be something that would, violate state law, for instance. But any of those changes, for instance, a ban on chokeholds or no-knock warrants, and these are things that have already been done, can be codified even further to make sure that they aren't changed with any change in leadership, election, etc. Yes, and the mechanism for doing that is exactly what we're doing right now, which is this consent decree process. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. I want to jump around a little bit before we come back to sort of the investigation and the findings by the department. I want to go to, something, Justin, that you referenced when you were talking initially, and one of the things that stuck out to me, and I'm asking you this question because part of what your organization does is talk with community members. And get insight from community members. And one of the things that stuck out to me as part of this report was what you highlighted is that to me, the report was substantiating what the Black and Brown community in Minneapolis have been saying for a very long time. And it was very clear in statistical, methodical way in supporting, what the community has been saying, and to me, it was an indication or a or substantiation of that feeling, and was really sort of directed at people outside of, in particular, the Black community, to say the Black community has been talking about this. It's something we've been hearing. Here's the really in-depth sort of substantiation and evidence of that. And I'm wondering whether you have heard in your communication with the community what the reaction is from the community about what the MDHR's findings indicate, and whether it substantiates that feeling that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, because if you go to the barbershop, Lucas, right, you will hear people say, we've been saying this for forever, right? But something, a dynamic that I think often gets overlooked is that after the uprising, which we could argue was still happening, people from white suburban moms or whatever group you want to point out, across the state and across the country and across the world, actually paused and said, wait a second, we've been hearing about racism for a long time. Maybe there's something going on here, because the way they did George Floyd is just unbelievable. And our nation did actually have an increase of support for more police accountability and policies in places where you didn't see that support previously. I was at the state at the time, leading the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, and I had multiple conversations with Republicans from around the state after the murder of George Floyd, who wanted to like pause and actually dig in deeper on these issues. And I think that that's really what these findings and other reports have done in these moments, is to affirm the experiences of folks who have been resisting oppression and demanding justice for generations, and the powers that be have not moved in support of what folks have been demanding. I mean, I myself have been a victim of police violence when I was a child, and have always wanted to see law enforcement move stronger into alignment with our communities in order to support building and advocating for safe communities. So moments like this are critical. However, it's important to remember that we've been here before. We've had George Floyd in Minneapolis multiple times before, and there's always a flashpoint, and people, this typical response is just wait for things to get back to normal. I think with the addition of the pandemic, that getting back to normal is becoming something that we're not really so convinced is going to happen, that we are in a new phase, which creates a new opportunity to put new structures in place that can move MPD and the city of Minneapolis to address problems that they recognize, and that they, in recent efforts like the work group findings they put out recently, like they clearly understand that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And I think the findings from the state affirm that. I'll just say tonight, today I'm doing multiple events where we talk about this issue, but tonight we'll be convening our first large group in Longfellow Park with residents in that area to talk about what should be included in the consent decree. And I'm excited to hear people's ideas, because like I said, we've been demanding change for a long time, but it's these moments where more people are aligned with the need for change, or if we just have the conversation, we can actually come up with solutions that make sense, or just a pathway that makes sense for us to start moving down. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Justin. I want to kind of go back to the investigation and findings itself, and I'll initially come to you, Commissioner Lucero, because I want to have a discussion about what the consent decree can do and what it can't do, and so the community has an understanding of what really can be achieved through the consent decree. And then I want to talk about, and I'll come to Justin and Professor Moran after that, in terms of what we have seen from other places where this consent type of decree type of thing has been used, and how that has been able to achieve some of the reform that people were asking for. And so, Commissioner, you talked a little bit about it in your presentation about the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is focused on investigating race discrimination in policing under state law, and that the MDHR is working with the city and the state regarding this consent decree. But I'm wondering if you can explain to us what we can expect the consent decree to be able to achieve, and then potentially what it is unable to achieve, what it's not designed to achieve at the end of the day.
Sure, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So I just the no consent decree can override federal law or state law, for instance. Is that what you're getting at, Lucas?
Yeah. So for example, one of the questions from one of the attendees is, does the MDHR, and in particular the consent decree, have the ability to change legislation as part of that process? Is that something that can be achieved, as opposed to changing some of the internal policies and practices of the Minnesota Department or the MPD?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it might be most helpful to explain this as a settlement agreement. This is a settlement agreement between two parties, and so two parties enter into a settlement agreement, and they one party is agreeing to make a lot of changes as part of that. And the difference here is this is a settlement agreement that is entered into court and issued by a judge and overseen by a judge, but no settlement agreement changes the law. Legislators change the law. Now, as part of a settlement agreement, there can be a commitment to work towards some changes to the law, or like some pieces of that, but that would certainly not be part of this. I think that what we did in the findings is really focus on all of the places where the city and MPD have control over changes that they themselves can make. So for instance, one thing that comes up often is the question around arbitration. Arbitration is something where they're like, look, could there be more done around arbitration? And could there be changes to state law? There were some important changes made around arbitration at the state level in the past few years. And I think we're seeing how that's playing out, and we'll see that play out. And it's going to take some time to see how that plays out, because there's so few cases that actually go to arbitration. Over the past 10 years, Minneapolis has only sent 20 discipline cases to arbitration. And there's all sorts of reasons why things were overturned that were fully in control of the city and MPD. For instance, taking over a year to terminate someone where there had been a sustained finding of serious misconduct, use of force violations. So these are things that are fully within the control of the city and MPD, and that is what the consent decree would focus on, things that are fully within the control of the city and MPD. Those are the policies, the training, the culture, those kind of pieces like that. And that is how it has worked in other cities across the state, across the country, where you can see them really kind of moving the goalpost. Seattle, where they had nothing in databases. They had, everything was in paper. So now things are in digital format, so they're able to use that data to see what is going on, where there are problems, identifying places. Is it perfect? No, but have they certainly moved it substantially? Yes. New Orleans, there was big problems in New Orleans where officers were going around murdering people pretty easily. And has there been huge changes to use of force in New Orleans? Absolutely. Is it perfect? No. But you're seeing those changes moving within the departments themselves, and officers getting more support that they need as well. I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you, Commissioner. Okay. And Professor, I want to come to you, and to the extent that, I know you said before that, you focus primarily on this accountability aspect of policing, and I think police reform. And I think that that's one of the big aspects of some of the frustration from the community, is that this sort of lack of accountability for Minneapolis police officers, but also the ability to understand from the community what officers have suffered some type of discipline. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, having done a lot of this research, what have you seen in other areas, whether it be by consent decree or some other means, to achieve some meaningful accountability for police officers?
Sure, I'm happy to tackle that question. And let me actually start answering it by giving an example of what Commissioner Lucero was just talking about, what can happen in a consent decree and what can't. And this issue of discipline and of accountability is a great example, because we have a state law that legislators have passed that says, in terms of what the public can see about misconduct allegations for police officers, they can see that a complaint has been filed and whether it was opened or closed, but they can only see the information about what the allegation was and what investigation took place and how it was resolved if discipline was imposed. So really, we only have public access, for the most part, to cases where discipline was imposed against a police officer. The Department of Human Rights and the consent decree can't change that state law that restricts access to situations where discipline was imposed. But what they can do, and what the Minneapolis Police Department certainly does have control over, is taking discipline seriously and imposing discipline where it's appropriate. And if they impose discipline, then the public has access to what was the nature of the complaint, how was it investigated, et cetera. I will repeat what I said earlier, and I know we've already gotten questions from the audience. Minneapolis Police historically imposes very little discipline on its officers. It takes a long time, but it also just doesn't do it for the most part. And one of the ways they get around discipline is through this process that some folks in the audience are familiar with called coaching, where there may be a sustained finding of misconduct by an officer, but they handle it by coaching the officer informally, and they say that that's not discipline, therefore the public can't see it. So one simple way that the City of Minneapolis and the police department could allow itself to be more accountable to the public is by treating coaching as discipline, or by imposing actual formal discipline when it's appropriate. So that's just an example here in Minneapolis that I think needs some real work, and that I haven't seen a lot of movement on yet, but I know a lot of community members care about. You also asked, where has this improved elsewhere? Well, about 7 states, I think, in the last couple years have moved toward more public access to information about misconduct. So that state law I mentioned that in Minnesota restricts access to situations where discipline were imposed, that's pretty normal, but it's starting to become more of an aberration. More and more states in recent years have, as a legislative matter, said, no, it's actually important that the public, who the police are ostensibly serve, that the public know what kinds of misconduct complaints are being filed, how are they being resolved, do certain officers have high numbers of complaints, things like that. The public cares about that, and more states are moving toward allowing more access to that. So I've seen a lot of progress in that particular area of expanding public access to information about misconduct.
Great, Professor. And I have one follow-up question for you. One of the things I saw in some of the research that you have done is just the sort of divergent perspectives of police management, chiefs, sheriff's offices, sheriffs, in terms of the perspective on making discipline records publicly available. And I'm wondering if you would share your perspective on that in terms of what the different perspectives you are hearing from inside these departments about making the accountability records accessible.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I would love to follow up on it. So a couple years ago, I did a survey of 350 law enforcement administrators. So that term administrator means typically a police chief or a sheriff, certainly a high-ranking member of the department. And it was an anonymous survey, but I also did about 35 follow-up phone interviews with folks who were willing to identify themselves. And we asked just questions about, how do you feel about public access to misconduct claims? Does this benefit your department? Does it harm your officers? And the reason we were asking the administrators is, if you talk to police unions, you almost invariably get the reflexive response that this is bad for the police department, that it's unfair for the public to have this information. People don't understand how policing works. It could harm officers. And it can be tempting to believe that that's what all police officers think. But when I was asking the administrators, they not only favored more transparency. It was a very diverse group of folks, and so not all of them favored it. I don't want to paint this as in a broad brush. There was a lot of diversity of opinion, but more administrators favored public access. And what was really interesting to me was that a higher percentage of administrators said this helps not just the civilians, but it helps our department because it increases trust. It reveals whether we're taking discipline seriously. And if we are, it shows people that. And it gives us a chance to show what our investigative process is. And that's a good thing. The administrators also said they couldn't come up with many examples at all where it had harmed their officers. And I think that's important because that is kind of the party line you hear from police unions, is this hurts officers, this could even endanger officers. And the administrators, I asked them, can you provide examples of harm or benefit? And they really could not provide examples of harm. And that was administrators from 12 different states, Minnesota being one of them, but tried to pick a wide variety of states.
Great, thank you, Professor. Commissioner, I see you raising your hand.
Well, I just really want to build off of what Professor Moran is saying, because there's something that she said at the beginning that I want to like really amplify. She's talking about changing the the formal accountability systems and how important that is. And she started this by talking about how, but you have to actually use those formal accountability systems in the first place. And you can't, and that's a culture thing. And so just going back to, just wanted to just lift that up real quick, because I think in the findings, we worked to tell the story that supervisors are tacitly or directly approving inappropriate and potentially unlawful behavior. And so that behavior is not even making it into any sort of accountability system, coaching or formal discipline processes. So then even if it were to be public, it never reaches it there. And we specifically, we provide an example of an MPD officer who came into a bedroom to find a 14-year-old on the floor using his phone. The MPD officer demands that the kid stands up, but the kid doesn't do so fast enough for the officer. And all of this is happening very quickly. The MPD officer takes out his flashlight and hits the kid hard across his head, causing the kid to bleed. And the officer grabs the kid by his neck, and he does what was, completely under policy allowed at the time, an unconscious neck restraint, which means that the MPD officer choked the kid until he was unconscious. There was additional use of force violations at the time. Following the incident, however, so there was that incident, but then there's also the review and the accountability pieces around it. And so in that incident, the supervisor reviewed the file and approved this use of force and said there was no violation of policy or law. And so all of these really important changes to accountability systems that are crucial also have to come with the change in practices and culture, because this is an example of a case where the supervisor deemed the officer's use of force appropriate, effectively authorizing the officer to continue using such egregious use of force in the future. And we see that happening over and over and over again throughout the 10 years, just this pattern of this. And so just this both and, which is why this can't be fixed with a change to policy here or a change to training here. And it has to be that sustained and coordinated action that goes along over time to really magnify the impact, I guess.
Great, Commissioner.
Lucas,
Justin,
can I double down on that real quick? I'm just sorry. So in the chat, I just want to make a really quick point. In the chat, I'm dropping two things that our organization has been working on. So real quick, the approach to addressing this issue cannot be insert policy, insert consent decree, outcome, everything is better. Like that is a lie that we tell ourselves about how to create real meaningful impact and change in the institutions that govern our society. What has to happen is a rainbow of options. There has to be a full arsenal in a war. You cannot just have one approach to things. And so the consent decree is one tool in what needs to be for community members. I don't need folks to understand this. It's one tool that we need to take advantage of to help right size what's happening in the culture in the MPD in the city of Minneapolis. In the chat, I just dropped our recent report on accountability and a toolkit that we put together in the MDHR to look at what's happening at the state through the post board, which governs the licenses of officers. And the licenses of officers gets to the issue of the profession across the state. The entire profession of law enforcement has never reckoned with its history of racial violence that it's facilitated in Black communities. There's never been a conversation about it. Some officers visit the Holocaust Museum through the COPS program, but there are no officers getting on flights and planes and buses and going down to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery to learn about how law enforcement specifically has facilitated harm in my community. And so what we want to do is make sure that law enforcement and the profession as a whole across the state is also having that conversation. The consent decree And the post board, just very clearly, the post board needs to be a place for accountability. It currently is not, and we want to call people's attention to how to do that. The consent decree in Minneapolis helps us right size the culture in the department, and helps and do that through the community perspective. These are all like different tools we need to be able to. My apologies, I see a comment. The post board is the licensing body at the state, the Peace Officer Standards and Training board that governs if you're a barber, you have a professional license. If you're a lawyer, obviously folks on this call understand what the restrictions around your license. Law enforcement's license has very few regulations, and you actually have to commit a crime in order to be held accountable by the post board, which is an insane standard. It's not a standard. And so there's work to be done there as well. So I wanted to share that with you. My apologies, that was a longer answer than I anticipated, Lucas.
No problem at all, Justin. And I appreciate the impact from or the input from everybody. And so, Justin, I want to come back to you because I was actually going to come to you anyways. And around this research about the post board, and what we're hearing, is changing this culture within police departments, and in particular in Minneapolis Police Department. And I wonder, from your perspective, I think it can be tempting, and I personally feel this way oftentimes as well, is like, well, we should be dictating to the police department what this whole system looks like, that they don't get a say. And a number of you, and I think including yourself, Justin, have referenced that it's important to have the police departments, the officers, be a part of this discussion. From your perspective, why is that important?
So I think about Brian Stevenson and Danielle Surratt, who both take the different approach to or the same perspective on some of these issues. That if the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. What does that mean? That is about having fair access, it is about having equity, is about accountability, is about all those things. In order to address like the needs of the people, you have to have justice. And Daniel Surratt says that the opposite of trauma, which we have all collectively been through as a community over these last 2 years, the opposite of trauma isn't healing. The opposite of trauma, which takes away your ability to act, is power. And so we need to be looking about ways for us to build power as a community in response to the trauma that has been facilitated by the systems that are supposed to provide community services to our community, that have done the opposite, that have never reckoned with that. As a matter of fact, they were designed during a time in our country. Policing was designed during a time in our country. We were not a multicultural, democratic society, as a friend of mine likes to say. And today we are becoming more multicultural, more democratic, and you are seeing the pushes and charges against that. And I believe that we have to build the power to fight back against that movement, to demand that our systems do serve a multicultural, democratic society, and also believe that we have to affirm justice as the solution to our communities that do not have what they need to thrive in our society. And so forgive me, I lost track of your comment, but you clearly of your question.
I can feel your passion, yeah. Justin. So just continue on.
Yeah. So what am I trying to say? Like, what role do officers have in this place? Imagine a world where officers didn't commute to work, right? Like from Buffalo to Minneapolis to serve our communities. Imagine we have to reimagine this whole thing, right? So imagine law enforcement that one doesn't just deny or sweep under the rug the harm that it's participated in, but understands that harm festers and grows into a cancer that hurts their profession. So being in our community, not being like moving to our community, but being from our community, not apologizing for harm that they've facilitated, but actually like being on the front lines and witnessing the worst the worst things that happen in our community. They know what needs to be done to address the issues in our neighborhoods. They see the gun violence. They see how poverty impacts people. Imagine if instead of just living in our communities, they were actually advocating for our communities. But today we are in a situation where too often the changes that we seek, even outside of reforms to law enforcement, are often met by opposition from law enforcement. And so it's like, what are we actually doing here? Do people even understand what the assignment is? That our communities, if we're going to be safe, we have to address this issue. We have to invite people into the mix. And I do think that there's a humanization of law enforcement that needs to happen, because as long as we just look at folks with a gun and a badge, that means we're not understanding the dynamics that motivate them to move against the things that we want to see done in society. And so, forgive me, I'm all over the place, but it is a definitely, I think the moment that we have right now through listening to community folks about what should be in a consent decree, efforts to transform the profession of law enforcement, none of that is even anti-cop. Right? All of that actually works in service to make sure that law enforcement has a better job, where they know what they're held accountable to, what standards they're held accountable to, who they're held accountable to, and why that matters. That is the shift that we are trying to make through this work, at least through our organization. So Lucas, I think I answered the question, and thank you for the opportunity, brother.
Of course. Thank you, Justin. And Commissioner, I want to come back to you and Professor Moran as well. Because we've heard news about that the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, is also doing an investigation, and I'm wondering if you can share a little insight in terms of how the Department of Human Rights findings and consent decree differs from the Department of Justice investigation, and where those two things stand.
Sure. Well, I can hop in on that. Just give a little background there about the Federal Department of Justice investigation. So the United States Department of Justice, specifically their Civil Rights Division, also started investigation into the City of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department. They started it almost 11 months after the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. So they announced that investigation on April 21st, 2021, which was the day after Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder. Their investigation is into different things. So Commissioner Lucero explained at the beginning what the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is authorized to investigate. They're investigating potential violations of Minnesota law, and specifically their investigation is focused on patterns or practices of racial discrimination. The Department of Justice has I guess you could say in some ways broader, although not necessarily more thorough, just different, investigation focused on patterns and practices of unconstitutional or unlawful policing. And specifically, they've kind of lumped that into 4 categories. 1 is improper use of force. 2 is violations of the First Amendment. And that specifically, I think, is largely focused on behaviors toward members of the media and protesters. If you think back to the summer of 2020 in particular, although this is somewhat ongoing, many encounters between law enforcement and protesters, and many folks who are trying to protest peacefully. The right to assemble is part of the First Amendment, the right to free speech. And so is there a pattern or practice of the city violating those rights? They're also looking specifically at youth. Has the Minneapolis Police Department engaged in unconstitutional policing towards kids in Minneapolis? And they're conducting an investigation on potential violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is with a specific focus on people with behavioral health disabilities and how the Minneapolis Police treats them if there are unlawful behaviors towards people with behavioral health disabilities. I don't know when that investigation will be complete. So just keeping in mind that it started almost 11 months later and that it has quite a broad mandate to pursue. So I've talked with some of the folks. The investigation is being conducted in part by both attorneys and investigators in DC who are specialists in civil rights investigations, with some work also being done by US attorneys here in Minnesota who are local to the area. So I'm confident it has been very thorough. They've investigated an enormous amount of things, but I don't know when their findings will be released. I will say, I know we've gotten a number of questions from the audience about have consent decrees been used in other cities, and I can speak to federal consent decrees, which may be what we're headed toward in Minneapolis as well. The DOJ may be aimed toward a federal consent decree, just as the Department of Human Rights is hoping for a state consent decree. And there has been some, they've been successful in other cities. I just want to point out that they take a long time. So Commissioner Lucero mentioned New Orleans as a good example, and that is a great example of a place where the consent decree has been useful and effective in changing policing. But I think it went into effect in 2013 and it's still ongoing. Chicago entered into a consent decree in 2017, and just a few months ago, they extended it by 3 more years. So I say that not as a value judgment, but more as a warning to people about how this, when you have deep problematic systemic issues, they tend to take a while to correct.
Great. And Commissioner, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I would just say when it comes to the DOJ investigation, so these are 2 separate independent investigations. And a person or an entity can be in violation of both federal and state law. Here, the City of Minneapolis is clearly in violation of state law. And as an enforcement agency, we are moving to make sure that there is an end to discriminatory policing practices in Minnesota under state law. That doesn't change the independent investigation going on at the federal level.
And Commissioner, I can follow up with you, or Professor Moran, feel free to jump in as well. How do those 2 things work together, if they do at all? So Professor Moran explained, obviously, and you explained, Commissioner, that the Department of Human Rights is focused on state law and the violation of state law, whereas the DOJ and any federal consent decree is focused on violations of federal law. And I'm wondering, if it ends up happening where there's some type of federal consent decree, does it end up that everyone, comes to the same table, including the DOJ, the Department of Human Rights, the city, the state, or how does that work? Have you seen that happen before? I'll start with Commissioner Lucero, if you have any input, and then Professor Moran, feel free to jump in as well.
So you're talking about a hypothetical future that doesn't exist. We don't know when the DOJ is finishing their investigation or what their findings will be, nor do we know what they'll move forward with. So they do consent decrees, but they've also used a whole bunch of other tools. So I don't know what they will hypothetically do in the future. What I do know right now is that there are violations of state law, and we're moving to prevent those violations to continue, because we have to make sure that we are really focused on the concerns that we have around these serious problems with race-based policing in the city of Minneapolis, which is really undermining public safety. And we don't think we should be delaying addressing those concerns. Those need to happen immediately. Now, in this hypothetical future that you're talking about, anything has to be consented to. That is the definition of a consent decree. And so those would all be able to be aligned at that point as necessary.
Great. Professor Moran, anything to add there?
I don't think so. I mean, I do think that there's potential for some overlap. I'm speculating here, but there could be overlap in terms of what needs to change. I don't know precisely what the logistics of that might involve.
Sure. Great. Commissioner, I want to come back to you because, one of the things we've been hearing, and there's been some questions in the by the attendees in the chat as well. But, one of the things we hear in the news media is, have talks between the state and city broken off? And what happens if the city or the police department says, we're not in agreement anymore, or they're violation of the consent decree? So where do things stand right now, and what happens potentially if there is some violation of the consent decree?
Sure. So those are, let me start with the first part of that. So yeah, there was a lot that was in the press where the city was asking some questions and at that point choosing not to attend scheduled meetings. And I guess just for some like historical context that might be helpful, it's not an uncommon place for a city to be there after findings come out. We've talked about New Orleans a couple times. New Orleans actually actively invited the Department of Justice in. They said, please come in and investigate us. Department of Justice did. And their findings came out and they said, what are you doing here? Like, what is this? No, no, no. And they were like, we don't know that we can meet with you. We're not sure about this. So for a city to actually see the findings, even after really welcoming an investigation, partnering to make sure that all of the information got there, doing a court order, entering into that court order. So just real partnership throughout the entire place. When the findings actually come out, to just need a moment to sit with that and to just like feel what that all means, that's okay. They can have that little bit of time, and then we got to get back to work. And that's what the city did. They took that moment and are back to work. And so we have had a few meetings, and these feel like they're very productive meetings. There's a city attorney, Peter Ginder, has reported to the city council multiple times that it is the intention to enter a consent decree with MDHR, and they have been working to into a court enforceable agreement, which is what a consent agreement is. And so that seems to be moving forward, and that feels very promising. I think there's a deep alignment here that there are some serious problems and that we need to address them. I know the city has been doing a lot of work already, and from my perspective, it's about making sure that this work is sustained and coordinated, because we've seen really thoughtful work occur over the past decade and decades, and then it doesn't last. And so that's where we are moving forward at this place. If we are not able to reach a settlement, then we move forward with litigation. I don't think that's where anyone wants to be. It's costly, it's expensive, it's not solution-based oriented when it comes to these serious problems with race-based policing.
And so once, assuming that there is some type of agreement in terms of a consent decree, and there's a judge order that lays out what the agreement is, what happens and what's preventing the city or MPD from just saying, we're not abiding by that? I know we agreed to it, but we've made a different decision.
Sure. So there's many options if any entity violates a consent decree, and so that can be fines, contempt, injunctive relief. There can be different tools that the court uses, but that is why it's super important to have a group of experts to really monitor the situation directly to the judge to make sure that that does keep moving forward. I think the important thing to note is something that Professor Moran said, which is important, is these things take time. And so making sure that the expertise and that you're setting really clear benchmarks and guidelines. And so there's not the expectation that we're going to solve racism in a year. That doesn't happen. Like changing culture takes a good amount of time. And so really being clear about what that looks like. So you're setting clear expectations and setting everyone up for success is important. And so then you don't have to get to that place where you're getting to fines and contempt and injunctive relief. That is not what is in the city is interested in either. So that's not what they're coming to the table to do either.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. We're getting close to, we have about 13 minutes left in our presentation. And Justin, I want to come to you because, you know, one of the things we talked about when all of us chatted the other day in preparation for today was, you know, why does this matter? Why is this different than maybe some of the things that have been tried and used before? And in particular, how do we now, I think all of you and Commissioner Lucero just hit on it, is how do we sustain that momentum, the pressure from the community to make these changes over the long period that it's going to take to achieve these results? And so from your perspective, you know, having this now, the potential of the consent decree, how is that, you know, how is this different than maybe some of the things that have happened before, and how do we sustain that pressure to make these changes?
Yeah, that's, I mean, that is the question. So, you know, my background is, I started my career as a social worker and an educator. I spent time as an organizer, a little bit of time at the state as a bureaucrat. And I have all these different perspectives on like how do you not a theory of change or a theory of transformation, but what is the practice of change? What is the practice of transformation? And I think that I wake up every day trying to figure out how to transform this criminal legal system and how to advocate for my community. And so when you ask me like why does this matter? You know, I'm thinking about the young people I've worked with for years. I'm thinking about the elderly folks that I've worked with, the Black folks across the state that I served in my previous role. And I think about the room of 35 formerly incarcerated folks that we met with a week or so ago to talk about this consent decree and why it matters to them. The reality is our systems are not serving our community, and the path towards change, the practice that we have to put in place is making sure that we build bridges and bring folks together across differences to talk about difficult topics and to wrestle with these things. We have to be willing to wrestle, and we have to be willing to move into proximity, as Brian Stevenson would say. And this opportunity on the table right now, it's an opportunity for us to do that. Rather, that's getting together in community and learning from each other, being willing to learn from each other. Something that hasn't been a high priority recently with all the division that people are sowing in our society. Think about the opportunity not as just to put together a consent decree or to provide input into a consent decree. Think about the opportunity is to move through this moment of tension towards a sense of mastery where we can actually start doing the things and stop thinking about things, but start doing the things that lead to greater change. It's hard. I'll be honest, it's a hard question, Lucas, because I want to give people hope, because people deserve hope. I love this city. People love this city. People want the city to thrive and be a safe place for everyone. It is not today. And we know what safe communities look like in other parts of our state. And all we're saying is that we want our own version of that here in Minneapolis, right? And it's a hard thing to tell people that, you know, this project isn't going to solve the problem, but it moves us down a path towards addressing this problem, like my brother Kevin Reese said. And that's why it matters. Because if we don't walk down this path together, if we don't figure out a way to work together beyond our differences, then, you know, empires are known to do one thing and one thing only. The outcome of every empire is the same, is that they fall. And I don't want that for my son, and I don't want that for the communities that we all live in and trust. And so I invite folks to join us tonight. I invite folks to join us on Sunday. I invite folks to reach out if you want to host your own engagement session. I know that WILD is planning on doing one to provide input into our report that we'll share with the commissioner, because it matters that the commissioner and the city, when they're trying to negotiate an agreement, have quality input from the community on what folks want to see in that agreement.
Great, thank you, Justin. And I just want to go to Professor Moran and Commissioner Lucero to give your final input here. And I want to kind of give a little insight or piggyback on what Justin was saying, in the sense that, you know, now is the time to build community. And obviously our community has been through a lot the last few years. And so how do we encourage people to continue to show up and have these conversations and engage in this discussion to make real reform? And so I'll pass it off to Commissioner or Professor Moran to give your final insights on those topics.
Okay, I'll start. I'll just speak as a white person. Justin was talking earlier about how members of the Black community in some ways felt affirmed with these findings, this investigation, because it was a confirmation of what they've been saying for years. And it's good that the findings confirm that, but it's terrible that they've been saying that for years and not enough people have listened. And so that's a reality that we can't deny. And it's also something that makes change. That's one of the reasons we're in a problem where change could take a long time, is because we've let problems fester for far too long. And, you know, we are in a state that is majority white. And so we bear a lot of the brunt of not having listened well in the past. And so in terms of how we move forward, you know, I'm a law professor. I believe in moving forward in legal ways, but I also, just at a totally human level, when we're talking about resilience and how we keep this moving forward, for the white folks, we can't shut off when the situation has gotten too hard or the world has gotten too scary or whatever. I don't mean deny every concern you have, but place it in context of what other people have experienced and how other people have been ignored. And we have to be able to listen and to sustain that listening and the action upon listening, even when it doesn't feel immediately comfortable.
Great, thank you, Professor. And now, Commissioner, any last words?
Yeah, so I guess my last words around this is, so I think as we were like looking at this over time, you know, we spent a lot of time looking at the reports and the settlements and all the memorandums of understanding and agreement that have been in existence with Minneapolis for the past 10, 20, 30, 40, the blue ribbon statements. And I think that there can be this real sense of deep frustration that many of the things that we are reading are the same things that blue ribbon commissions from 50 years ago are saying that people should have done 50 years ago. And so it can be very frustrating. But I really feel like there's two options. Like, we can do more of the same, or we can try to do something different. The status quo is not working in Minneapolis. It's not working well for anyone. It's not working for community members. It's particularly not working well for Black and Brown community members. It's not working for police officers. And this just can't be what we accept and allow to continue for our city. Like, it has to get better, and we have to try, and we have to use all of the tools we have to figure out how we can get to a better place, to figure out how things will be different tomorrow. Because public safety isn't an option. We need to interact with public safety whether we want to or not. We will have police, we can call them different things, but we certainly will have police, and government will always play a role in providing safety for our community. So we can't just shut our eyes and make it go away. We need to make sure that policing is fair and just and effective and free from discrimination. And so that is why a consent decree is just different than what's ever been tried in Minneapolis thus far. And doing anything short of that would be just doing what has already been done before and failed for 50 years. And I'm not willing to concede that we should keep doing things with the status quo. And so, you know, I know there's a lot of people doing this work, and they have different strategies and goals and tactics. And I just appreciate all the work that's going on to imagine a Minneapolis that is thriving and joyful. And it is that imagination and the actions that will help get us there, even though it is very hard to see that sometimes, and to keep moving it forward.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. And Justin, I want to come back to you just in 30 seconds or a minute. We've talked about community engagement. One of the things your organization is doing is listening sessions. So I want to come back to you and let you promote those listening sessions again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lucas. And I couldn't agree with the commissioner's comments more. So this evening we'll be at Longfellow Park in South Minneapolis. Once again, all this information is on our website at mnjrc.org/events. This Sunday we'll be in Northeast Minneapolis. Forgive me, I don't have the location off the top of my head. And then through the rest of the month, we'll be on the north side. We'll do a citywide event. And we really want to invite everyone. These are public events for everyone to come to and contribute. Angela, I see you. It'll be good to see you tonight. And just there's a simple activity. We'll do a little bit of education, talking about the history of misconduct in the city of Minneapolis. What is a consent decree? And then we'll wrap up with an activity where folks can actually provide input in response to questions that we'll be asking. So it's a very simple evening. We'll have food for folks, and hopefully we can start to develop that sense of community around this issue. So we invite everyone to come and visit our website for additional resources.
And Justin, these discussions are designed to get input from the community about what is actually included in the consent decree. Is that right?
Yes. So we will be asking questions and leading an activity where folks will be taking notes in the discussion. We'll share back with the large group, and what we gather from the discussion will go into our report that we'll submit to the commissioner in August.
Great. Thank you. Well, I appreciate all of your attendance today and all of your great insights on the consent decree and how the community as a whole, we can push the ball forward to achieve a meaningful change for public safety in the Twin Cities and hopefully attain a city that we can all be proud of and that serves everyone who's there and who lives in this community. So I appreciate all of your attendance and keen insight today. I appreciate all the attendees for attending as well. We will be having more listening sessions on other topics and wild conversations as well. For any of those who are attending, with respect to the CLE code, the first word was consent, the second word is decree. So you'll need to have those for the CLE code. You can also follow WILD and TC Dip on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook. We'll be highlighting some of our additional wild conversations as well as our listening sessions with the community around the consent decree. We appreciate everyone's attendance today, and we look forward to seeing you again. And again, a big thank you to the panelists for attending today and sharing your insights. So thank you very much. Everybody have a great day.